being aware that you have ancestors who have fought. So although we're still oppressed, I thank God every day that I don't have to wake up on a plantation. I mean, I know I have challenges and there's oppression, but seriously, we had ancestors that had to do that, right? And suffer all kinds of abuses, especially women, sexual abuse. Imagine breeding, as we talked about the 3 M's in slavery, as soon as menstruation happened, breeding. And men studied. So breeding camps. So sometimes we don't understand the things that have historically happened that still are happening in our community, right? Sometimes there's men who make children and they walk away, right? Sometimes we have women who incubate. They have the children, but then don't necessarily raise them because there was a time that that's what happened to us. We didn't get to always keep family. So being together as a family was a privilege during those times. So we have to be aware, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about post-traumatic slave syndrome that will go into even more detail about that. So intergenerational poverty, I just want to talk a little bit, as I said before, about money. This is very important. I heard it in some of the other talks just about the union and, dues, different things, all of that. Money is important. So also intergenerationally, we haven't always been taught what to do with our money. So it's very important for us, even like when you start working, already start thinking about retirement, as we heard, because the time goes and how are we investing? What are we doing with our money? Are we making our money grow for us? So while money isn't everything, economics is very important. So we have to think about building intergenerational wealth. What are we leaving for the next generation? I hear my mom talk about all of the things that she didn't have, and she worked very hard to build what she has now. And where I am now, in terms of my education, that is a result of all that they have sacrificed in order for me to be there. But we want the next generations, right, to not have it be as difficult if possible. Okay. So now let's talk about manifestations of trauma. So internalized depression. How many people have heard of internalized depression? Raise your hand. Okay. So internalized depression is just that. We internally take in what the oppressor has put upon us. So all of those negative beliefs, attitudes, sometimes we take it within ourselves. And unfortunately, we act it out against those who look like us, right? So it doesn't mean that it has to be someone from outside of our race and ethnicity to experience racial prejudice, right? Unfortunately, through slavery, we have colorism, which is you, right? And we see it through the Caribbean, Africa, America, everywhere. Because unfortunately, we were taught that the closer we were to white, the more acceptable we were. So unfortunately, we had all of the negative terms that went along with being dark, tar baby, all of these kind of negative attitudes in terms of where we didn't love ourselves or our hair. If it's kinky or not nappy, not acceptable. I teach my daughter all hair is good hair, right? Because sometimes the good hair was only like the soft, wavy hair. And if you have nap or a kink, it wasn't acceptable. But these are all the messages that were given to us. And that's the making of a slave. Let's put the old against the young, the strong against the weak, right? The straight hair against the kinky hair. And this is where we have division. So when we have division within ourselves, it makes it difficult for us to come together. But this is a safe space. And I love everything that everyone has talked about today already. Like, if something is not your thing, that's okay. But if that's what your sister needs to do, we support her, right? So this is what we're working on, is loving ourselves. Because when we love ourselves, we can only love each other, because when we see our sister, we see ourselves. So oftentimes we're like, hey, what do she? She always got an attitude. She always got. But oftentimes it's not about the other person, right? It's about what we have going on internally within ourselves. So the more we heal, as our speaker before, the other doc talked about with parenting, family of origin issues. What were you taught? within your home. So all of that impacts us now, and that carries over to our relationships. It carries over to our parenting, and it carries over to how we are in the workplace with each other. So I want to specifically talk on the next slide about post-traumatic slave syndrome, or PTSS. Can you click again for the areas to come up? So go back for me. It should have letters on there, but we'll see. Has anyone heard of post-traumatic slave syndrome? Yes. This is a very good read. It's not an easy read, of course, because it's talking about our history, but it's important because it's talking about the impacts of slavery, some of the things we see happen today. So I do clinical work full time, and I work with with men and women. I serve veterans full time work, but I also have my business that I do independently. And I had a female patient once tell me that when she was coming up, her mother called her the B word. Like, called her the B word to the point of like that was her name. But as she talked about it, she said that happened to her mother. It happened to her mother before her. So that was the tradition that was being carried on. And she did it to her children, but she recognized, like, you have that kind of moment, like when you kind of wake up and a light bulb goes off and it's like, wait a minute. I didn't like when this was happening to me, so why am I doing this to my children? So she decided to do something different. So that's how you break those cycles. Otherwise, it's intergenerational. But sometimes we feel we have to do things one way because that's how it has been done. But we have to recognize that normal isn't always healthy. Our norm is just what we're exposed to. If we're exposed to a lot of violence, that's our norm. If we're exposed to a lot of love, that's our norm. So what I work on is how do we get to that healthy space? So there used to be what's called like spoiling behavior. So when children, particularly girls, got of a certain age, the mom wanted to protect her in slavery time. So she would tell Massa, oh, she ain't no good. She lazy. She don't, no, you don't want her. You don't need her. She's no good. So, but this was protective, right? Because mom didn't want Massa coming sniffing around. So sometimes what may have been a negative was adaptive and protective in that time. But the challenge is when we keep behaviors that are no longer adaptive for us. It's like if someone goes into a combat zone to fight war, they have to be fight or flight all of the time because it keeps them safe. However, when they come back in their home with their families, they don't need that level of a response. So we have to recognize that there may be times that we need to shift our behaviors. You can move on to the next slide, please. So what's important to recognize, they're like key patterns of PTSS. So vacant esteem. So this is where we are feeling sometimes hopeless. There's something missing within us. There can be self-destructive outlooks about ourselves and our community. So some of that, it also may be termed like learned helplessness. Sometimes when you are in the same situation all of the time, it seems like there's no hope and it's difficult to move on. So there's also propensity for anger and violence. And as I said, sometimes in the States, we term it the urban trauma because some of what is happening is the low socioeconomics, the negative messages that continue to go from one generation to the next, and a lack of respect. So because of that, sometimes we have this acting out within our own community. So then we also have to realize that that internalized racism is a result of that. So we definitely want to work on that, and we'll talk about that later. Next slide, please. So part of what Dr. DeGray talks about with MAP is the multi-generational trauma, that because trauma has happened and there's an absence of an opportunity to heal or to work through that trauma, post-traumatic slave syndrome occurs. So this is not a diagnostic. This is not a mental health disorder. This is more so a theory to help explain some of what we are experiencing in our community. So I did want to reflect for a minute. So just being in a space and hearing about historical trauma and the communities of color that have been impacted, what kind of things are happening now? Like, what thoughts are you having, or feelings, any questions or reflections? Anyone? I heard someone say something. Do you want to share? Well, we'll take time to take your one comment. Do that, and then we will move forward.
I just want to go back refer back to the video.
Yes.
In terms of the intergenerational trauma and whether or not, or well, it gave the idea that it can be stopped, the cycle can be broken.
Yes.
But for me, and I'm no pessimist, I see it as somewhat of a utopia that we're hoping to get to a place that we will never really get to. Why? Because the structures
Yes.
that are supposed to be working to get us there, they still remain broken.
Yes.
And we as a people have not come to that point to appreciate who we are, to realize that we are a product of our past.
Yes.
And if we are to continue to live and define ourselves the way our masters have defined us, we will never get to that place. How is it manifesting now? You spoke about, for example, the studs. Men were, we were breeding slaves, women to have children, and for the men to be studs. And we're still seeing that. We're seeing where families, we still have broken families, and we say, oh, well, that is how it has always been.
Yes.
So how do we get to that point where that perfect society, and I'm being deliberate with my word, how do we get there when we remain broken and we continue to define ourselves in the way that those who created the problem have defined?
Love it, love it, love it. See, the one comment will do everything. So move to where you see the circle. Keep moving forward. So part of what you're saying is, so what we want to do is disrupt the cycle. So in the middle, you see historical trauma, and around it, you see some prominent symptoms, and it's not limited to this. You see anxiety, isolation, loss of sleep, anger, fear, violence, substance abuse. Part of what you said, the key is we have to define ourselves. So we are some of the first generation where we could even have a thought like, oh, well, maybe that doesn't fit who I am. Like for me, my hair has been natural now for 14 years, but I had the pressing comb, I had the perm, I had the jerry curl. Oof, terrible times. But again, not by my choice. So you see intergenerational trauma. I didn't say, hey, this is what I want to do. This is what was done to women before us. So we just do the same thing. My daughters never had to relax their hair. My oldest, 25. My stepdaughter, she's natural. My youngest, 10, she's natural too. So again, this is because we're defining ourselves. We're saying, no, 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 no. We don't got to do this. This is who I am. Why should I fight against? And me, let me tell you, I got Africa Bambaataa here. I'm here to tell y'all. It looked like the super fist. That's how tight my coil is. So it's just a fight for me to try to keep that straight. So we go through so much, as that was said earlier, with our hair. Hair is traumatic within itself. If you ever been beat because sit still, don't this, don't that. But the answer to your question is we have to start to now define who we are, and it not be based on the colonized version of what was given to us, and only then can it shift. So sometimes we see that within homes, but as you said, structurally it's not there all the way, but we have to do a little bit at a time and work on changing policy. But if we start doing this individually in our home, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and this is what we demand as policy, this is how it changes. We heard earlier about democracy. Antigua is a democracy. The U.S. is a democracy. We have to utilize the systems, even though imperfect as they may be. That's a whole other talk. Next slide for me. So I want to talk a little bit about PTSD. So the easiest way to remember PTSD is through the acronym RAIN. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health disorder. It's a part of the DSM-5, and there are certain criteria. So the first criteria is one must have been exposed to some type of trauma, and I just defined trauma earlier on. So it could be exposure yourself to trauma or witnessing someone else exposed to trauma. Then after that, there's re-experiencing. Those could be flashbacks while you're awake. This is like thoughts that come back to your mind, or it could be an image of something. A is avoidance, avoidance of people, places, things, anything that is a reminder of the trauma. Okay, it could be a smell, it could be a sight, it could be a place, it could be a sound, it could be anything. Then we have I, which is increased arousal. That's that exaggerated startle response. That's like something happens and we jump. It's that feeling like we aren't safe in spaces, even if we may be in a safe space. Then N, we have negative cognitions, negative thoughts, or negative moods. So that could be depression, it could be anxiety. So sometimes what is happening is that we are experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms. Now, what is different with post-traumatic stress syndrome, as I said, that is not a diagnosis. However, some of what we experience with race-based stress, the symptoms look exactly like PTSD. So if you're being discriminated on your job, if it's in your school, if it's in your workplace, if it's in your own home, what you're being told by parents or by a partner, all of that becomes traumatic experiences, and they could look, race-based stress could look the same as PTSD. Next slide. I'm going to try to breeze through and save some for the afternoon. So intersectionality is just an important model to realize, because we are not just limited to one aspect of ourselves. We're not monolithic. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about now is race and gender. Before I go forward, Mrs. Luke, I see lunch is here. Do you want me to pause and maybe continue in the afternoon? Because I don't want to go into the lunchtime. What is your preference?
I will get you up to 12.
15? Okay, so race and gender. So this is an important model. Kimberly Crenshaw is a female legal scholar who coined this term, and this comes through Black feminism. And Black feminism is different than feminism because, again, intersectionality, what we have been fighting for as women of color sometimes look different than our white female counterparts. So we have the intersection of our race and our gender. So it's important to be aware of that. Next slide. So women of color and mental health, as you've heard it earlier in terms of just women, what we experience in the world. So now what you're doing is you're making it multiplicative, right? So now you're multiplying stress that you may be experiencing, not just because you're a woman, but because you're a woman of color. So unfortunately, there are disparities just in terms of higher levels of depression, anxiety, other concerns in terms of mental health issues. So that is something that we have to be aware of. So it's very important in terms of the workplace to recognize this intersection. Next slide. So, barriers to treatment, the superwoman syndrome. How many people are aware of the superwoman syndrome with our cape, right? We heard earlier in the talk, right? We're taking care of everybody else and we leave ourselves last. So, as it was said earlier, stop that. And if you find you have a hard time, stop. And this is where find a good therapist, a counselor to help you through it. Because again, it may be very ingrained in us because we hear things like idle time is the devil workshop. Be up and doing. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. So we get all of these messages that we should just be workhorses, y'all. Like we should just be slaving all of the time. We serve partners, we serve children on the job, and then the least is left for us. But I'm here to tell you, Black women are at high risk for hypertension, diabetes, high cholesterol, and all of those things together leading to cardiac events. So meaning heart attack, stroke. So what I have adapted, I said, I'm the captain of my ship. So I said, I'll be damned, because if I go down, this ship is going to go down. So, but you have to find a way to rethink it, because when we are raised that we take care of everybody else, what happens if we get sick, right? So we have to take care of ourselves and remind ourselves that by taking care of ourselves, we are taking care of partners and spouses. We are taking care of our children, because I think ahead, what would her life be like if I'm not here? So let me do the things that I need to do to keep myself. But all of these are messages that were handed down to us, right? The strong Black woman. Next slide. The strong Black woman. So some of that comes from slavery because we were strong, right? What else are we going to do? you know, because that was the situation. So we also will hear in this time, well, our ancestors didn't have no therapy, so why we got to do it? It don't mean that they couldn't have benefited from therapy. It's just that they didn't have that opportunity. So also there's a wonderful book, Rest is Resistance. That's a wonderful way to conceptualize taking care of yourself, because our ancestors could not take time to resist, right? They can't say, I'm not going to pick that cotton, I'm not going to pick that sugar cane. They had to keep going. For us, rest becomes our way of saying, okay, we are going to rejuvenate and take care of ourselves. Also, there's a lot of stigma that comes along with seeking help. Are we going to be thought of as the C word? Crazy? Are people now going to not trust us, to run our household? So we sometimes live in fear that we cannot seek help. Next slide, please. So mental health disparities, we talked a little bit about that, so you can go to the next one. Move forward for me, because I know we're limited time. So this is one area I'd like to talk about, because keeping in mind, where do we form our beliefs? So strong Black women, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, all of those are women that we are aware of that are skewed on a positive end of strong Black women. But then also on the negative side, we also sometimes are seen as the angry Black woman. So meaning so women in general, if we express ourselves, it's seen as aggressive, because we are not socialized to have those type of feelings, right? It's okay for men to be angry, but a woman's angry, she's a bee, right? Now, when you add on top of that, again, that intersectionality of the Black woman, it becomes the angry Black woman. And it's like, calm down. Are you okay? Do you need some help? It's like, no, when I'm angry, you'll know I'm angry. But again, we are not always given the same level in terms of privilege to express ourselves. So other negative stereotypes include like the Jezebel or the video vixen, where unfortunately Black women are often highly sexualized. So sometimes there might be limitations in terms of seeing our intellect and other aspects of ourselves. So these are some of the negative stereotypes that sometimes we have to fight against now. So next slide, please. We were talking before lunch about stereotypical images. So in terms of stigma and why sometimes we don't seek help, there are different types of stigma. So when we think of on the public level, these are the negative attitudes that we have to deal with. And it might be in structures such as the media, what we hear on the television, what we read in books. There's different kinds of stigma. So on the public level, we may feel that there's a level of shame that goes along with it. Then self-stigma, similar to the internalized oppression, we internalize stigma now because we have been told something is wrong. Oftentimes, historically, for women, we've experienced anxiety at high levels, and not because of there's something wrong with this, as our sister Veronica talked about with the 3 M's. Medical conditions often come with hormonal shifts. So we experience different kinds of moods, whether it be depression, increased anxiety, or worry. So we shouldn't have to feel ashamed to want to seek help. But unfortunately, sometimes this is a part of our experience. Now, the institutional stigma, we see that this is within systems, right? So as we heard earlier, it may not be set up where we have time off for medical conditions. It may be counted as a negative against us. So all of these become barriers sometimes for us seeking help. I started a podcast called New Horizon, the Mind and Body Connection, for that reason, just so that we could learn about mental health in a destigmatized way, just talking about it. Like, mental health is health. So there's nothing wrong with talking about it, how we manage stress. We're meant to experience a range of emotions. Now, sometimes what's important to recognize is that mental health is health, and we all experience that, but not everyone will experience like a mental health disorder. So when we get to the panel, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk about now are other reasons that we may not seek help is because of medical experimentation. Are you all familiar with medical experimentation? So unfortunately, the terrible things that have happened over time, the Tuskegee experiment, we had the asexualization acts that took place in America and other places too, Black women, Latin women being at a higher risk of hysterectomies. They termed it the Mississippi hysterectomy because it was a way to have population control. So unfortunately, we have been exposed to a lot of medical experimentation. So sometimes we say, I don't know if I want to go to no doctor because look at the things that they, even with the pandemic and with the vaccine and vaccination. I work in a medical setting and I'm a Black person and I had to think about it twice because I'm like, look, okay, this is something I know I need, but at the same time, I was thinking about medical experimentation. So for me, that means doing more research. I needed to read about it, see who created it, when it was created, what's the research showed as side effects. So that's the difference now is that we have a choice, right? With Tuskegee, they went into it without having all of the information. So keeping in mind that we may not seek help because of what has happened to us historically. Next slide. So medical apartheid, if you are in the medical field, if you're a nurse, a doctor, counselor, anyone, I definitely think that it should be a read in terms of working with the population, but it's also a good read just in general. But medical apartheid, Harriet Washington, she talks about what has happened. So unfortunately, slave women, women of African descent were at higher level for experimentation. So birth control, right? It revolutionized the world, but unfortunately all of the negative impacts that happened during experimentation, that happened on African women, Latin women, low income women. IUDs, which are also helpful today, unfortunately a lot of the negative effects had fallen on African women or those who were slaves. So keeping in mind that a lot has happened that will cause us to not trust the system. Next slide. So does anyone know who that is? That is the immortal Henrietta Lacks. So if you haven't read about her, they have the documentary now in the movie. What is important to recognize about her is that her cells began what was the first and for many years the only human cell line able to reproduce indefinitely. So what happened? She was having issues, concerns of cancer. She went into Johns Hopkins to get help, and they took her cells without her permission, and then they discovered all of this. Now, these are the building blocks of any vaccine, any medicine that you know of in this time. Many of them have the HeLa cells that are hers. So even the current COVID vaccine that we have contains her cells. So what is important to remember about this is lack of consent. Right? This is what happens when people use bodies, women's bodies, brown bodies, Black bodies, bodies that people feel that they can misuse. Now, her family was not given the financial revenue that came from a multi-trillion-dollar industry in terms of pharma. So it's only in recent years that her family has had some access to that. So again, understandable that when things happen, it may be difficult for us to trust. This is why it's also important for us to go into research areas, medicine, nursing, all of these areas, because when we see us, we are more likely to engage and to trust in those areas. So it's important as we're talking about women and empowerment, recognizing that we have the opportunity to create these safe spaces for each other. Right now, I have a female OBGYN because that's just my preference, nothing against the others, but that is my preference. So it's wonderful to be in spaces where we can have that now. So racism in healthcare also goes back to being pathologized within the system. So there we see there's a slave that was beaten because he tried to run away from his master. So Samuel Cartwright coined the term drapetomania, which is a pseudoscientific term he believed was the cause of enslaved Africans fleeing captivity. So think about it. The natural response to captivity is escape, right? You tried to flee, but we were pathologized and said that something was wrong with us for wanting to escape. Well, why would this person want to leave? They're being housed, they're being fed. And I mean, there were people who believed this, and it wasn't based on any science. So this is the other part of why there's a lack of trust, because pseudoscience for so long was acceptable. So we have to recognize that within healthcare, sometimes there is that limited ability to sometimes want to seek help. But for me, that was part of why I went into psychology, because I wanted to work with my community. And I know that it was important for people to see people who look like us, who also know and understand the history and also have lived experience. So does historical trauma only have negative effects? Thank goodness not, because we would not be hopeful, would we? So we have a lot, even what was talked about earlier in, our experiences, we learn to have resilience. I was talking with Sister Veronica over the break too. It's like necessity is the mother of invention. When you don't have things, you figure it out. And part of that is the resilience, it's the adaptation, it's the evolutionary effects that we learn how to do things. So with trauma, there aren't only post-traumatic experiences in terms of the negative. We do have positive things that we gain. People learn to be empathetic, understanding, and sometimes people even grow beyond where they were pre-trauma. So it all depends, because everyone has a different makeup. So we use now the biopsychosocial model, where instead of just nature or nurture, it used to be nature, okay, we can't change our genes, so that's it. Then nurture would be our environment. But now we understand it's a mix of all. It's our biology, it's the psychological makeup, our personality styles, but it's also in our environment. So it's all of those things that come together to make us who we are. All right, next one. So ways to enhance our life despite being exposed to these historical and intergenerational traumas. So first we have to acknowledge it, right? If we don't know that something is going on, we can't move past it. But again, there's stigma, shame, there's things that sometimes nobody in the family talks about, and denial is a natural psychological defense. So when the psyche doesn't want to deal with something, it finds ways to push it away, right? Other people could be seeing stuff and telling us, and we're like, I don't know what you're talking about. So sometimes we have to get to the point of just accepting truth within our own world. So now when we acknowledge what's happening, we can work to have an understanding of the historical trauma, and we can focus on healing. And healing has to start with ourselves, right? Once we heal ourselves, then now we can extend it to within our homes, our children, our neighborhoods, our communities, and then we have that ripple effect. So sometimes the psychological defense can be deflection, right? If we're always worrying about what somebody else is doing, or trying to fix somebody else or put somebody where we think they should be, sometimes that is a defense mechanism, because it's taking us away from what we need to do for ourselves. Because guess what? Sometimes leading by example is the best way to go. When somebody sees, oh, well, she getting it together, because I know she used to, having some issues, but she seems calmer when I got to give her feedback now in the workplace, and that she's this and that, because I'm working on myself. So when I work on myself, then other people see what is happening. So what are ways we can enhance, and then that could lead us segue into our panel. Next slide, please. So spiritual, religious ways and cultural healing. I started with this because unfortunately, through colonization, imperialism, all of that, we have been taught sometimes that our natural indigenous cultures are not acceptable. So what we know and understand, science is confirming what we knew all along, that culture is important. The culture that we call them, the things that our grandmother taught us, all of those things, they have meaning. So they're definitely cultural rites of passages, things that are important within communities that help in form of healing. Psychological treatments, that could include counseling, psychological assessments. Sometimes diagnostic clarification is needed. Like if you're having problems with concentration, several things can be linked to that. It could be anxiety and worry. It could be depression. It could be ADHD. It could be loss. Grief also manifests in that way. Is it one of the three M's? Is it menopause? Because sometimes it's foggy brain. So diagnostics or psychological assessments sometimes helps us to understand what is going on, and then that will help with treatment planning. So counseling, psychotherapy, all of those are ways in terms of moving forward. We also have psychiatric treatment, which is more so medicine. The psychological treatment is going to be psychotherapy, which is skills. Pills may be medicine. Now, I know sometimes we don't like to take medicine, but if it's what is needed or necessary, that's something you can talk through. So I don't do medicine because that's not what I'm trained to do, but I work with many individuals who maybe if they're having to do medicine for a time along with psychotherapy, then over time maybe weaning off of the medicine because the psychotherapy becomes enough. Like several years of trauma, sometimes medicine might help to take the edge off, and then that coming off of that because the psychotherapy and healing becomes enough. There's also social justice and advocacy. Everything we're talking about today is being social agents. Social justice, how do we disrupt the system? How do we change? How do we make things better? So those are also ways that we work through, and is a form of healing because it helps us to feel like, okay, there's hope. I was talking during the break about the radical healing framework. The radical healing framework means that we don't limit ourselves to what healing looks like. Sometimes we get stuck in like, oh, but I can't think about that because all of these things are happening, but we have to. Because if we don't think beyond our circumstances, sometimes we will never move beyond those places. So if you're in a traumatic situation now, think beyond that. Think about safety. Think about freedom. Think about health. If you're in a situation where it's challenging with a spouse or with children, think about what it looks like to be in a healthy relationship, what it means to have a healthy relationship with your children. Because if we only stay in those areas that feel like a deficit, it will be difficult for us to move forward. And lastly, but not least, education. Everything falls onto education, and not just formal education, right, in terms of academics in school, but how can we educate ourselves in what we may need. Mrs. Luke talked earlier about, voting with the EAP. So is it education about policies? Is it about what's going on at your children's school? Finding the tools that you need to be able to move forward. So I just have 2 more slides and then we wrap up. This is just a really good article, and I'll make sure that I will get the slides out. But this is a great article that, again, science just showing that indigenous or our ways of knowing that come from our culture are important, because oftentimes we're in Western frameworks and we're only given Western type of models, but acknowledging that those things that came from Africa, that came from the indigenous people, those are also a part of who we are, and it's okay to embrace and accept that. And my last slide, we have some different forms of racial healing now through the Association of Black Psychologists, which is a mix of mental health professionals, mainly psychologists, but also allied fields that work on scientific and African-centered forms of healing. We have Sawana virtual healing circles, and those are free options. We also have EECs, or emotional emancipation circles, which were created along with the healing network. We have Be the Healing through Dr. Joy DeGrye's book that we talked about, post-traumatic slave syndrome. We have native healing circles and smudging for those who have indigenous background. Shamanism is also a form of healing. Religious and spiritual cultural healings, the Takini Institute. There are many institutes that are linked to what we would call today's conventional type of healing, but also looks at historical and intergenerational trauma. So all of these become ways that we can heal, and I think that will be a great segue into our next portion. Thank you.